For millennia, inadequate versions of Dasein have been in power. Hellenistic echoes of the Neoplatonics, classical Athenian juxtaposition of the moving world and of Fusus and the unmovable object of the region called Psyche, psyche in Latin, soul in English. In times closer to us and immediately near adjacent pasts, as it were, of Heidegger, to use this sort of metaphor which has come popular very recently, the notion of somebody being behind their time, ahead of their time in terms of their thinking, rather than being on the in Platonic terms the eternal plane, but if one think in, as it were, terms free of Plato, Mishima, for example, we have this notion of the cultural imperialism of the West, making it so that earlier beings are what we must refer to in Western terminology, because we are Westerners, because we lack anything that goes beyond our language. We only have our language to give expression to the Welt with, to the world with. We must say it was something which wasn't constrained in this way, and Mishima, speaking in his British English, expressed it by saying that there were the monocultures and then the cultures that realized there were one culture among others. That's sort of like the other way to put that is, the cultures that spoke of the Gaijin as the foreign devils, or the barbarian in the case of the pagan Greeks as the inferiors, even if Socrates regarded himself as it's surprising if one were to suggest that Socrates, when he called himself cosmopolitan, did this merely mean that the polises, all the citizen cities, many of which were, of course, given constitutions by Aristotle, which were all Greek encampments, the so-called, I think this Manuel de Landa, who's this big interpreter of Deleuze and Guattari, well, I should say I want to correct a false impression on an earlier recording that I shouldn't have said that made it such a close connection to Judith Butler and Deleuze and Guattari, because in fact Judith Butler isn't really a reader of Deleuze and Guattari, but I think it's only that in this sense of being critical theorists, they're kind of in the same tack, they're kind of in the same D-file, in the same commitments. But okay, that just as a thing said in order to excuse the non-explicit statement in the earlier recording, but let that go. But to go on, in this case we have the closest ones to Heidegger, clinging to him almost, are Carl Jaspers. So we're very far away from the remote distance of the world, which is totally unaware of what a culture alongside other cultures is, but only regards sort of something which in a transformed and distorted form perhaps we find in in Schmidt, the friend-enemy distinction, the barbarians and the Hellenes, the Gaijin and the native Atii people or the Japanese. But there's only the inside and everything else. So this is Dugin attempts with great force and great guidance to bring Russ back into this position where it can, without special effort, gather its full berserker potential, as it were, because it knows that it's not a relative entity, but not even an absolute entity, because that's a special form of giving expression to this state, which is unnecessary when you're in the state, when there are the state, when there's not even a necessity to make this distinction between in or are or anything else. In other words, something that's ineffable, inexpressible is become the case. Total division from the classical liberalism out of those seas. Some water lanes have been placed down, which at first they're called traditionalism, but then no longer need to be called that once they've reached a full stature of their independence. Taken this way, it's very remote from this beginning of history in the pre-Socratics, and then in the first understanding of Dasein, according to, say, the distinction in Heraclitus between the river as such for the suke, and then the river for the senses, or for this which changes in the line of being, this which is effectively changing in an observable, empirical way, the so-called waters, but this is a very vague